Hello and welcome to the video lecture for consciousness, or chapter 6 in our online textbook. First thing we need to do when we start to study consciousness is to think about what counts as consciousness in the first place. And I do want to put a warning up here. The study of consciousness is incredibly complex. Scientists of all stripes study it, including neuroscientists and psychologists, experimental psychologists, and all sorts of microbiology, as well as philosophers. And it's a confusing field. Social scientists study it, biological scientists study it, and oftentimes people from all of these different fields will say that the word consciousness is a so-called term of art. And when you hear that, it means that there's no real consensus among most thinkers or most people as to what the word even means in the first place. So every time you read about consciousness, or every time you write about consciousness, you have to specifically say the version of consciousness that you are actually discussing in the moment. And a lot of times, one thinker will be talking about something radically different to another thinker. So in this chapter and in the next article that we look at, Ned Block's article, we will think of it in sort of roughly two different ways. And this is by no means the only way to think about it, but the way it is presented to us in this particular chapter and in Ned Block's article. This is a very rough guideline or first draft on how you might divide it in your mind. And one sense of what is conscious is qualia, what we've been talking about for a pretty long time. Just your everyday experience of being alive. So every time you wake up, you have experience. You have an entire world of experience that is private and ineffable. It's the universe around you. And that is one definition of what being conscious is, having any kind of internal experience. Another way to think about what consciousness is or could be defined as is something like rational thought. And by that I mean the stream of thought you have going on inside your head. It's not necessarily following out a logical set of steps or argumentation. It's just the ability to have thought, a stream of thought or consciousness inside your head. It's separate to experience. It might have to do with language. It might have to do with the ability to abstract concepts. It involves things like executive function, where you can plan and take in data from the environment and weigh which option is the best for you. This kind of stream of thought versus the entirety of experience. And it might be good, re our previous definition of what diachronic and synchronic are as concepts. It might be good to keep in mind that we're usually talking about a synchronic kind of consciousness. At a snapshot or a moment in time, you have a phenomenological, meaning the phenomena around you, set of experiences, and you have access to some parts of your mind that you can use in your stream of thought. You don't have access to everything because you have your whole set of memories, every single thing you've ever learned, every single thing you've ever thought or dreamed or hoped, and you don't have immediate access to all of that at once. You only have access to part of it, and that is what we think about when we think about what is available to you at this moment in time to rational thought or your stream of thought, what you're currently thinking of. So these two frameworks are, okay, actually it's not these two frameworks. There are two major frameworks aimed at developing a theory of consciousness. This one that we're looking at in this chapter mostly, of Ned Block's access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, And in the next set, or the next unit, we will talk about David Chalmers' easy and hard problems. That's a sort of different way to classify the same problems that we have even defining what consciousness is or what it counts as. So for now, we'll focus on Bloch. Phenomenal consciousness is qualia, what it's like, the set of experiences that we all have being alive and awake, any kind of internal experience. The wider study of phenomenology is not limited to this particular way of studying consciousness. It's the entire set of people who study what particular phenomena capture the experiences that we have as human beings, and there are other approaches to it. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on the what it's like of our phenomenal life. An access consciousness is the mental workspace that we currently have available to us. That's that executive level function for our current stream of thought. And it's things like language and using abstract reasoning. And you can sort of think of it as the first pass is what you're aware of in any given moment. There's a whole lot to our experience on our peripheral vision and our hearing, what we can smell, what we can feel, taste, touch, but we're focused or aware of some more narrow field of things. Another thing we need to talk about before we delve into concepts of consciousness is an idea about mental representation. So when we say in everyday language that something A represents something else B, it seems pretty straightforward. The thing that stands for the other thing in some way. One of the most common examples is language or word. The word CAT stands for something out in the world. It represents something out in the world, whether it's a particular cat that's sitting on your lap or the entire species of things that could be called cats. But the word cat stands for or represents those physical things in the world. So a mental representation is a hypothetical thing, quote unquote, in our minds that stands for something else. But on the face of it, and that's what prima facie means, it's way more difficult to say what that thing is because, again, we don't even have a good theory of what the mental is or how it emerges from the physical brain structure that we have. So if we don't understand that yet, it's hard for us to say what exactly in our brains creates the representation. And in the mental world, what exactly is the representation? You can close your eyes and imagine something that's not currently in front of you. There are actually some people that don't have that cognitive ability. And we might think of that as a representation. But when we talk about mental representations, it needs to be much wider than that sort of imagining. A mental representation would be anything in our brains or minds that stood for something out in the world or even stood for something in our internal selves. So we might have a representation of an emotion. So that's what I mean here when I say partially we can't have a good definition of what a mental representation is because we don't have a consensus on what a mental state is in the first place. Of course, that doesn't mean we can throw away the idea of mental representation altogether because our thoughts have content. So there's some structure and we're not all sure what the structure of the representation is, but we do know and we are familiar with the contents of our mental states. So if you have the belief it will rain tomorrow, that has the content that you believe it'll rain tomorrow out in the world. But if you believe that it won't rain tomorrow, you have different content. You actually believe something else about the state of the world. So there is representation, even if we don't yet have a clear way to define how that representation is structured in either our brains or our mental landscape. Now, we'll see in Bloch's theory that With his access consciousness and his phenomenal consciousness, he makes a case that our phenomenal consciousness, or what it's like, isn't necessarily always representational. Sometimes we can have representational content in our qualia, as if we see a shape that's representing that shape's figure, but sometimes not, he makes the claim. Sometimes experience is non-representational. We'll go into a bit more detail into representationalism as its own topic a bit later on in the semester. But sometimes complex abstract theories are best introduced with examples. So this chapter in our online textbook gives us a variety of flavors of representationalist theories of mind. They are proposing theories because, again, this is sort of like an exciting place, but also a confusing and uncertain place in human study because it's new. Consciousness studies have only been around for a couple decades in their contemporary form, so people are still investigating how best to form their theories and their concepts. Our chapter looks at first order representationalism, higher order representationalism, reflexive representationalism, cognitive theories, and information integration theory. At the very end, it mentions awareness or attention, which is relatively new in philosophical theories, at least. The argument is made that it's actually the only kind of consciousness that physical scientists or neurochemists and neurobiologists have really been looking at, if you look at what their experiments are about. So first order and higher order representationalism. Okay. First order representationalists argue that all of our phenomenal experience, the what it's like to be human, can be described as representing something. So if we see redness, we're representing redness in an object, in our experience, or in our minds. So in first order representationalism, that's just the totality of what redness is, our representation of a color in the world. And another flavor of first order representationalism is that redness supervenes, just like the mind supervenes on the brain. Redness supervenes on the physical object because of the molecular structure of that object, the way light reflects and refracts, and the way our particular human eyes take that in. So for us, we have redness supervening on that particular object, or the totality of redness is how we represent color in the world. Higher order representationalism is kind of thinking about thinking, which is what we do in philosophy all the time. But this kind of theory of what consciousness is wider. I would say that you need higher order representation to count as conscious. You need to be aware of the fact that you're thinking. Even if in any given moment you're not aware of how your brain is processing color, you are aware of your experience at all times. And that's higher order. You have experience, and then the higher order is that you're aware of that experience. So the argument would be that maybe other animals, like other mammals like dogs or cats, they might have experience, but they may not know that they're having experience. They're just in it. They can't take a bird's eye view and contemplate that experience. They have first order, but they don't have higher order. Now, reflexive representationalism at first glance, as our author of this chapter notes, can look a lot like higher order theories, and the differences are subtle and maybe too technical for an introductory philosophy of mind. But one thing that we could note is that RR, or reflexive representationalism, argues that the structure of the mental representation and the contents are the same thing. So we have been talking about how we intimately know the contents of our mental representation, even if we don't know the structure. And RR says that they're the same thing. The contents are the thing itself. Cognitive theories, tend to come to us from outside philosophy, from scientists, from physical scientists. And as a contemporary philosopher of mind or a philosopher of science, you can study philosophy of biology, you can study the philosophy of psychology and psychiatry. You have to be aware of what has been empirically supported or unsupported by evidence, because otherwise your rational organization of the world isn't going to be in line with the materialist theories that you claim to be. If you claim to be a materialist, you think the world can be described empirically, you must shape your abstractions upon what's actually happening in the world. So cognitive theories from scientists are very important to philosophers of mind. And often they don't even invoke the concept of representation at all. Sometimes they do, and it can be muddled. And a lot of people argue that this is partially why philosophers are still important, because when scientists are focused on observing the world, they might not necessarily interpret it in a consistent way. If they're focused on one tiny piece of their field. And there can be confusing overlaps of terminology. So they'll speak of something like global workspaces, which we'll see is a thing in the Block article. But the other big problem with cognitive theories can often be that they ignore qualia completely. It's ineffable and it's difficult to describe, so they just pretend it is not important to the description of consciousness. This what it's likeness is the problem that we've been grappling with for weeks. So most philosophers think that purely cognitive, meaning like information processing, like a computer, purely cognitive theories can't capture everything about consciousness, and we need to find a way to introduce qualia into those cognitive theories. And that was a little bit of a highlight. Information integration theory is kind of a cognitive type of theory. And even while scientists and philosophers agree that information processing must have something to do with consciousness, we take in a lot of data, something goes on in our physical brain that's unconscious to process that data before we even become aware of it. But we still don't even have a consensus on that, on how those physical processes happen for everything, let alone how they turn into qualia. And this particular theory, information integration theory, argues that all consciousness is information processing. It has to be very, very complex for you to get consciousness, but it's still just all information processing. And as an end to this, in the past several years, philosophers have started to focus on attention, meaning whatever you're paying attention to in the current moment. Focus. Sometimes you become aware that there's been a noise in the background of your environment for a long time, and you're like, oh, now I'm paying attention to it. And sometimes scientists seem to focus exclusively on that as what consciousness is. So philosophers have taken a renewed interest in what attention is, if it's an integral part of being conscious, or if maybe that's all consciousness is, the ability to have attention on something. And they've only begun to debate whether or not that is a strong theory for what consciousness is. So in the next unit, we'll talk about Ned Block's article. If you have questions, as always, email me or come to office hours.